Hello, welcome to Washingtontok. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. While North Korea is taking a pause after back-to-back missile launches, high-ranking diplomats from the US, South Korea, and Japan got together in Hawaii. The US Biden administration continues to stress the need to further strengthen sanctions and at the same time reiterates it remains prepared to engage in diplomacy. Will the meeting of the three countries make any difference? Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Joseph Yoon. Ambassador Yoon served as the United States Special Representative for North Korea Policy and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Korea and Japan in the State Department. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the show. Great to have you both today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In January, we witnessed a record monthly number of missile tests, and now the top diplomats from the US, South Korea, and Japan met in Hawaii. This doesn't happen often. Ambassador, can we interpret this as a more proactive, concerted effort from the three countries?
Thank you very much. Happy to be with you and my good friend Scott Snyder, who knows more about North Korea than anyone else I know. So happy to be in such good company. We've had provocations, missile launches since January. This is really being stepped up. And I do believe the fundamental reason why North Koreans are stepping up on their missile testing is to send a clear message to our side that they are a nuclear power and they want to make it so that they stay that way. And by testing a lot, by accumulating nuclear material, getting more and more sophisticated missile technology, they're making the case, whether you like it or not, we are nuclear weapons power with ability to strike practically anywhere. So that's why I think what they're doing now.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, what do you think about what Ambassador just said?
Well, even in Australia and Hawaii, the core diplomatic challenge that is on people's minds is the Ukraine. And so I think that this trip and this set of meetings is really about shoring up diplomacy in East Asia and trying to warn actors in Asia, including China and North Korea, against the dangers of opportunism. Basically, I think that what the U.S. is hoping through this series of meetings is that countries will take away that we're aware and not distracted by the situation in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, I just wanted to follow up on what you just said. You said that this is North Korea sending a message that they're a nuclear power. So they're not really in a hurry to have a talk with the United States right now?
They are absolutely not in a hurry for a couple of different reasons. I think Scott is completely right that, everyone feels that US focus is more on Ukraine, Russia, even on China than in North Korea. So North Koreans feel Americans are distracted. And so they're taking advantage of that distraction, number one. That's number one reason. Number two reason is really their North Korean expectations on what Biden administration will give them is very disappointed. They've been very disappointed. So I believe they think that going to talks on the current circumstances is not going to yield much results. So, as you know, during the Trump administration, Trump and Kim have exchanged many, many letters. They've had 3 highest level meetings, but yet they're very disappointed that Biden administration is not clear in its strategy, nor is it engaging with them, talking with them at high level. So far, only thing they hear is lower level officials saying we're prepared to meet you anywhere, anytime. That does not mean much to them after having gotten used to such high-level talks with Trump.
Right now, the trilateral meeting is taking place in Hawaii, and the foreign ministries of South Korea and Japan just released press releases about the meeting. The South Korean foreign ministry stressed the three countries discussed measures to resume the dialogue with North Korea as soon as possible, while the first thing the Japanese foreign ministry mentioned was that they discussed ways to strengthen deterrence and full implementation of the sanctions. Mr. Snyder, are we seeing some difference in perspectives here?
Well, I personally think there's really nothing new there because Japan has always been primarily focused on deterrence. South Korea under the Moon administration has had a vested interest in promoting dialogue, and it has been the job of the U.S. and the Biden administration to try to meld those two different approaches together into a single approach that would represent a trilateral consensus. And so I think that continues, that challenge continues. In the end, these relative differences in emphases, I think, continue to be manageable under U.S. leadership. But I have to underscore, what Joe was talking about earlier is just so important because basically the Biden administration seems to have backed itself into a corner where by allowing the North Korea situation to go on with relatively low prioritization, they're almost inviting the North Koreans to try to escalate their way into a dialogue. And that is not the way in which we want to enter into this sort of situation. Also, it's true, it's not clear that the North Koreans are really interested in coming to the table at this time.
Ambassador, what do you expect to see after this meeting? Are these three countries really in lockstep about how to resolve the North Korean issues?
Look, the number one diplomatic and tactical goal of North Korea is to divide the enemies. Divide Washington from Seoul, divide Tokyo from Seoul, and they have done that very, very well throughout, and they're doing it particularly well now. So what you just mentioned, the different perspective of Tokyo and Seoul, it shows how divided they are. South Korea wants to engage North Korea and find what's called a peaceful way out. Japan wants much more hardline policy pressure. So Washington is caught in the middle, trying to bring the two together. And that's a tough ask. And really, the geographic reality is that both Japan and South Korea are much, much closer to North Korea than United States. Both of them feel the threat much more. And so they are going to assert themselves, both South Korea and Japan. And, so expect to see fragmentation of this as the provocations from North Korea continues. The other important point is, of course, China. And this is critically important. And again, North Korea succeeded at splitting Beijing and Washington in their goals on North Korea. So actually, even though, economy is poor, there is raging COVID conditions throughout, I do believe, North Korea sits kind of, in a good place in terms of regional and global diplomacy.
Very recently, the U.S. think tank CSIS released the analysis saying that North Korea has built a military base for the purpose of stationing ICBMs. Considering all this, Ambassador, are we back to the crisis we faced in 2017?
No, certainly not. We're not there yet. If you remember 2017, it was a terrible time. I remember There was an incident in Hawaii where people thought North Korean missiles were about to strike them. That kind level of tension, no, we don't have. And I think we're not going to get there until North Korea does one of two things. Either tests an ICBM or test a nuclear device. So those are what we call major provocations. I mean, true, their last missile test was what we call IRBM, intermediate range ballistic missile. And that was serious. But they need to go a step further and test ICBM. And then I think if they do multiple ICBM tests, we will quickly back to the kind of tensions we experienced in 2017.
Mr. Snyder.
Of course, the problem here is that North Korea has signaled its intention to shed its self-restraint. And I think the most recent test is the first step in that direction. And so that means that we are on a pathway to return to the situation as it had existed in 2017. But I think, unfortunately, under much more difficult circumstances in terms of the ability to try to manage the situation. We don't know how far North Korea is going to want to go once it sheds its self-restraint in terms of its testing regime. Also, South Korea is no longer positioned to play an effective role as an intermediary between the US and North Korea. And as we already discussed, the Biden administration really doesn't want this to be at the top of its agenda right now. And all those factors, I think, make it different from the situation as existed at the end of 2017.
Ambassador, when we look back at 2017 and 2018, the situation with the North Korea had dramatically changed. Do you think what was done back then to turn around the situation could be applied to the situation right now?
I do believe that a new diplomacy is needed to get back to at least, walk back the situation in North Korea. And that has to be led at high level from Washington. And I think that would include, for example, Secretary of State getting involved, as well as President Biden getting involved. So I think they have to get involved in some way. Now, President Biden has stated he has no interest in meeting with Kim Jong-un, at least until there is an acceptable agreement between the two capitals. So that means some homework has to be done. He can still send a letter. He can still send a senior level envoy. So I do think higher level of involvement is necessary. So that's a basket. Someone has to carry the basket to Pyongyang from Washington. Second, what is in the basket? You cannot go with an empty basket, So what is in the basket is important. And again, once the basket is determined, you have to put in something. So you have to consider, what steps are you willing to take? Are you willing to promise them, if North Korea takes certain steps, for example, stopping missile tests, what is it that you can give them in return? If, North Korea agrees to shut down some facilities, what can you give them in return? So that kind of commitment that you have to have. So you have to have both the basket and the stuffing in the basket.
Mr. Snyder, we have been talking about this for long, really. And do you think there should be done more in the higher level from the U.S. side?
I do think that the Trump administration in some ways spoiled the North Koreans with its high level of attention. And it does raise, I think, a real dilemma for the White House and the president in terms of how they deal with the situation. The Trump administration and President Trump himself, he claimed through his personal relationship to have solved the problem when actually the only thing that he did was to manage the problem. But now, in the face of potential escalation of tensions, we have to ask ourselves, well, what were the benefits of actually having a management system in place framed by the personal relationship between the leaders? In some ways, compared to an escalating situation, that is not necessarily a bad situation. But I think that Biden is going to want to be very careful about how he approaches that set of issues, because our aspirations continue to be not to just manage the situation, but also to move it in a positive direction.
In a recent interview with news agencies, South Korean President Moon Jae-in said a meeting between U.S. President Joe Biden and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is expected to take place eventually, adding that it is just a matter of time. Mr. Snyder, how did you take this, what President Moon said?
Well, I took that as a natural extension of President Moon's worldview and peace-first approach to the Korean Peninsula. He's invested so much in trying to, open the way toward a negotiated solution between the U.S. and North Korea. And even despite the adverse circumstances over the course of the past year or two, he remains committed to that. But whether or not his projection is true, that remains to be seen. And I don't necessarily think that just because President Moon is expecting Biden to meet with Kim Jong-un, it means that it's going to be very easy to actually achieve that.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, what did you think about what President Moon Jae-in said about the meeting between Biden and Kim Jong-un?
I think it's easy to say if you're not personally involved, as he won't be, in a couple of months' time. These are all conjectures. But I have to point out that North Korea has been a kind of a global challenge for decades now. So in terms of importance, it is similar magnitude. Peace on Korean Peninsula is a kind of similar magnitude of challenge as peace in, Middle East. So every statesman is attracted to trying to resolve that. And that's been the case of almost every American president I've worked under. Once they see some kind of path, they want to be involved. So if there is a path to bring denuclearization, to bring Korean peace agreement, then of course Biden will get involved. But I have to tell you, at the moment, they just don't see that path.
And meanwhile, the U.S. and China don't see eye to eye on how to deal with North Korea. China keeps calling for easing sanctions, and the U.S. maintains North Korea has not earned that. Mr. Snyder, is this something that has been expected all along?
Well, under conditions of major power rivalry is the main focus of U.S. strategy. Yes, it's very hard to bridge the gap between the U.S. and China. It really leaves us in a situation where there's two possible alternatives in the event of Chinese non-cooperation. One is for the U.S. to try to go around China in order to put pressure on North Korea, which is exceedingly difficult. And the other is to try to make China take responsibility for North Korea. But of course, we know that that's very difficult. The China-North Korea relationship is really almost a codependent relationship where North Korea refuses to be fully controlled. And so I actually think that there's going to have to be a lot of therapy involved before it's possible to imagine that China is going to be able to control North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Yoon, from your experience as the top U.S. diplomat for North Korea, did China play an important role?
Oh, China plays a huge role, absolutely huge role. And certainly when I was working on North Korea, I made many visits to China, had many meetings with China, and really tried to understand their concerns and what they want. Now, one of the most difficult thing that facing Biden administration on North Korea is, of course, the fight between Beijing and Washington over many issues, not just one, over many issues. So it makes cooperation on North Korea very, very difficult. And so that's the fundamental challenge. And, for the Chinese, every issue is related to the other. So there is so much quid pro quo in their diplomacy, and it is very difficult. I can just imagine on North Korea issue to try to enlist even tiniest of help from North Korea, from China. And you saw the Chinese, along with Russians, blocking any sanctions measure in UN Security Council. So that's going to be a huge challenge. And over the short term, without some improvement in Washington-Beijing relations, I think it will be very difficult. And again, North Korea succeeded in really putting a gap between Washington and Beijing.
So, Ambassador, that means that realistically, there's no way to press North Korea, or it's difficult to find a way to press North Korea without involving China.
It is, I would say, impossible to press North Korea without involving China. Really, anything that has happened over the, last 20 years, any kind of forward momentum had to have, stamped from Beijing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's one hypothetical pathway that could be pursued, and that would be for Biden and Xi themselves at the leadership level to personally prioritize compartmentalization of North Korea from the rest of the relationship, and basically make North Korea an area where the U.S. and China agree to work together. But under current circumstances, it really doesn't seem there's much momentum in that direction. It's just, I think, the only plausible pathway forward.
Mr. Snyder, do you expect to see more provocations from North Korea after the Beijing Olympics? Or do you expect to see some talks getting underway?
We have a South Korean presidential election on the horizon. North Korea is focused on the 110th anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birth. And then later in the fall, there are leadership meetings in China that may have an impact. But I do believe that we could see some additional types of demonstrations. I can imagine the possibility of returning to a satellite launch effort, for instance, or other types of provocations that continue to test the response of the international community.
Ambassador, what do you think will happen now? What is a card the U.S. can play?
Well, without something different from Washington, such as higher level engagement and making clear what North Korea can expect Washington to do, without any of those, I think provocations will continue and situation will get increasingly tense. And so I worry about that. And so let's hope that after the Olympics and after the South Korean elections, Washington and Seoul, as well as Tokyo, can work more cooperatively together to forward some of the things that's going to initially manage the situation. So I think before we can get to a solution stage, we need a management stage, and that's what's needed.
Earlier, China claimed that sanctions have blocked humanitarian livelihood goods, such as agricultural machinery, medical equipment, and water purification pipes from entering North Korea. However, VOA found out those products have already been exempted from the sanctions. And not only that, these products were already shipped to China and are waiting for the North Korean regime to open the border, which one could say very ironic. Ambassador Yoon and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.